Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Scientific Governance and Risk meeting number 163 here at MakerDAO. My name is Peyton. I go by Pros11 on the forums, and I'm one of the governance facilitators here. This is our weekly meeting where we talk about what's going on in the protocol, as well as some key issues, things we're debating, and would like some community input on. So we appreciate everyone joining us live and watching the recording later. A couple of housekeeping measures before we get started. We do want to encourage this to be an open meeting. So if you do have questions, feel free to either hop in when there's a lull in the conversation or throw them up in the sidebar. We'll try to get to them as quickly as possible. Since it is an open discussion and we are, encouraging people to talk, the only thing we ask is not to talk over one another. This is being recorded, so the clearer we can document the discussions we have here, the better for the community. So as far as agenda goes, we got a few things on our plate. We'll start with our traditional governance roundup before heading into a couple community discussions. This week, the things we're discussing are also up for signal requests, so it'll be cool to see how today's discussions kind of carry over there and maybe or maybe don't influence the vote. And if there's time after those topics, we'll have an open discussion at the end. So if you have like an off-topic question or topic, I would encourage you save it to the end. But if something that is being discussed does spark your interest, feel free to ask your question, or like I said, drop it in the chat if you're unable to. I think that should about do it for ground rules. We'll try to keep this about an hour, and I'll kick us off here with our general vote governance update. Words. All right. So lots of polling activity this week. We had 4 polls pass and 1 poll be rejected. The 4 polls that passed were adding the staked ETH, Lido staked ETH vault, the Nexto institutional vault onboarding, the direct deposit DAI module or D3M, and an increase to the GUNI DAI USDC debt ceiling. 1 poll was rejected was the supplemental compensation for paper Imperium. Would also want to draw everyone's attention to the 6 ongoing ratification polls. Those end on October 25th, and 1 active green light poll that ends on Monday, and that's for the Curve staked ETH pool. Awesome. So that does it for the polls. As far as the executive proposals, we did have an executive proposal passed last week that concerned offboarding particular vaults, MKR vesting, and core unit budget distribution. So that has been passed and executed. You can see its effects on chain. Is announcement that we will not be having an executive proposal tomorrow. The only thing that would have been ready was the GUNI debt ceiling increase, and we decided, especially given a lot of the travel schedules with people going to Lisbon, it would be best to skip the executive for this week and bundle that one change in with the others the following Friday. So that should do it for me and the update on the votes. Next, I'm going to kick it over to Pablo, our MIP editor, to give you an update on the world of MIPs.
Hello, everyone. Pablo here. So ratification polls went up on Monday, the 11th, and will run until Monday, the 25th. There are 6 ratification polls for this governance cycle, and we are going to take a quick look at their current state now. Yep. So we can see that most of the proposals have a winning yes. The exceptions are Maker Labs and the budget for the content production core unit, who might be resubmitting for November's governance cycle, a revised version of the proposal. The DECO fixed rate also had a winning no, but there's been a weighty redistribution of the votes recently. There's still 11 days to go until ratification polls close. Now we're going to take a look at the stuff in RFC. Yes, thank you. We can move on. Yeah, so we haven't had any new additions since last week, so I'm just going to do a passing mention of the proposals here. So we have the MIP 60 intangible asset assignment, MIP 61, the dedicated compensation, which is a bit of a proof of concept MIP. We have 2 budgets. It's a proposal for adding a special purpose fund. It's a proposal for amending the MIP 6 application template, and 2 coordinated proposal sets. these proposals can make it into November's governance cycle. In the formal submission window for that cycle will open in 18 days on Monday the 1st. That's pretty much it. I don't have any more right now. So can we go to the last slide so I can say bye-bye? Thank you. That's it from me. Thank you.
Thanks for the update there, Pablo. David was asking if we knew what the SPF was, the special purpose fund request.
Yeah, that's the first one is for a feasibility research into, I'll give you the details in a minute if you guys want.
Was that the only one, or was there a second SPF?
No, that's the only one so far.
Okay, cool, got it.
Yeah.
So it's to do a real world asset feasibility study in Singapore and to examine the different legal scenarios and hurdles that one would find whenever dealing within this jurisdiction. So it's a bit to improve how things are dealt with real world assets wise in that region. I'm unfortunately not an expert on this topic, so probably it's better to direct any questions to Will Remmer.
Yep, neither am I. Thank you, Juan.
I appreciate that. And thanks for the question, David. He's already shared the link, so I will go ahead and toss it over to Artem for the forum at a glance update.
All right, welcome everybody to the Forum at a Glance, a weekly review of what's happened on the forums this week for the week of October 7th to October 14th. Let's begin with the week's top announcements. Following up on last week's presented initiative for clean money, Rune submits a comprehensive thread on the design for the Sagittarius engine, which will better direct the value flows of the Maker protocol towards long-term governance participants. However, this is just one of many mentioned benefits of the design. Check out the whole post for a deeper understanding of the Sagittarius engine. Next up, Paper Imperium circles back to a recent discussion on the impact of US-based financial regulations towards the crypto economy. However, this time Paper Imperium presents potentially good news. Gaining favor in some circles is the notion that an unrepealed section of the 1933 Glass-Steagall Act provides a more clear direction for MakerDAO. There are 3 exceptions to the act, which can well position MakerDAO if deemed a loan guarantee protocol. Next, Seb Ventures follows up on a previous poll and this week's RWA committee discussion on investing in financial assets. His post includes an overview of their idea, their legal structures, their brokers, and concludes with their next steps going forward. Moving on to top 3 discussions. MakerDAO needs to have some kind of regulatory strategy for the US and other major jurisdictions. Paper Imperium builds a discussion thread to promote community brainstorm on what we see as significant challenges and how to address them. Paper Imperium presents his response to the issue along with potential solutions to start to kick it off. All right, next up, there's been a lot of discussion around mitigation of legal tail risk for Maker as a DAO. To help better understand the community's opinions, Paper Imperium asks how important is it for a DAO like ours to have decentralized governance? And finally, next up, with 3 billion USDC in the PSM, Dallin addressed concern on revenues and associated risks. He proposes to deploy a new leveraged ETF product that is scalable. Dallin provides some objectives and examples within the thread. Moving on to our signal requests, we have 4 active signals. In reaction to the initiative for clean money, Long for Wisdom creates an initial signal asking the community whether they would like to see MakerDAO move in the general direction indicated by the post, The Case for Clean Money. So definitely go and put your vote in. Next up, Long for Wisdom believes the best path forward with recognized delegate compensation is to run a 3-month trial period according to the system proposed by Psychonaut in MIPs 61. Long for Wisdom asks whether we should trial recognized delegate compensation as described in MIP 61. Next signal request. Maker is reaching a point where the core Maker security is so battle tested that the emergency shutdown feature is beginning to become a risk rather than a solution. With 75,000 MKR only needed to trigger the emergency shutdown, it's most likely a place for someone to try to damage the system. Rune proposes to double the trigger amount to 150,000 MKR, which will reduce the risk of a sudden emergency shutdown and make the system more reliable. And our final signal. Subventures has been diligently pushing the idea to set PSM fees to 0%, which is also suggested in the case for clean money. If the signal were to pass, Sebastian provides many long-term pros and cons and discusses how setting PSM fees to 0 would anchor the perception that one DAI is equal to $1. And that's it for the forum at a glance. If you want more information, would check out the post. It includes a 3-point summary, some evaluations, reports, and audits, ongoing initiatives, and also help wanted. Thank you.
Awesome. Appreciate it, Artem. As always, quite a bit going on in the forum, so thanks for highlighting a few of the bigger things going on. It's obviously been a pretty busy time between Rune's proposal and a whole bunch of other important like regulatory things. So another, I guess, reminder that we do have a suggestion box, as well as you can always reach out to us if you're curious about getting a topic on this call for further discussion. Today, we kind of split up discussion into two signals that are currently active. First one being Seb's on those PSM parameters, and the second, I believe it was Rune who drafted on changing the ESM threshold as well as the governance delay parameters. So those are going to be our kind of two discussions. We'll try not to spend too terribly long on them, but at the same time, if there's good discussion, I'd rather not cut it off. I think the plan is to start with the discussion of DAI, the DAI PSMs, and what the 10 and tout fees should be or could be there. I know you wrote the signal, Seb, so I don't know if you were curious and kicking us off. If not, also happy to have like PE discuss kind of the pros and cons and the thoughts behind the parameters and what they're there to be used for.
Yeah, thanks. I don't have too much to say because I didn't prepare anything, sadly. But I guess the signal request was quite well structured, and there was pro and cons, and there was some quite interesting discussions. And so I guess it's more to get questions and let the discussion happen.
Yeah, Seb, maybe you want to just restate what the signal is. That way, if anybody's like listening to this out of context,
yeah, sure,
they have an idea.
Yeah, sorry about that. So the idea is to change the soft peg of DAI, which is around $1. And currently it is from $1 to $1.001 or $0.02 if you use a USDC or USDC or USDP as a stabilization mechanism. Obviously, that's only until we depleted 3 billion of USDC, so still quite a liquidity buffer. And so the idea is to put it as an hard peg where $1 would be always equal to 1 DAI, or most of the time equal to 1 DAI, with no contractual guarantee whatsoever, but still a best effort, I would say, by having the 3 million USDC, by having the possibility to deposit 1 USDC or 1 USDP or one other regulated fiat-backed stablecoin into a PSM and get 1 DAI in exchange and do the opposite as well. There are a lot of pros and cons, but in my perspective, it's really, and I told that in the signal request, it's just like at some point there were banknotes from different banks and that was not traded at par. And the financial system, way before the central banks and all those regulations, fixed this issue. Because obviously we want to use the dollar. I want to use the euro, but most people want to use the dollar as a unit of account. And it's always easier if everyone is using the same unit of account. And it's mainly, I would say, when you are doing some financial instruments that are quite complex and they involve a lot of flows, it's always better to have a fixed peg. And yeah, last difference last part that I think it was important is that if there is some cost to go on to DAI or to trade from DAI to another stablecoin, it's the customer, so the DAI holder or the DAI, yes, DAI holder at some point who is paying for them. So we are making your user pay for the benefit of using DAI, which doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, so I'll say just from the technical side, I'm not really sure why PE is listed here. Some individual members, I think, have opinions on this, but from like just a purely technical standpoint, there's no issue, I think, with lowering this. So as the PE group, it would be fine to make this change unless somebody else on the team wants to counter that. But I believe that's the case.
Yeah, I just want to echo what Sam said there. From the technical perspective, you know, this is not really an issue. So the PE core unit, you know, really can't have an opinion on this other than to tell you that there's no technical risk. Members have their personal opinions or opinions as MKR holders, but when they express them, they're just that, the opinions of those individuals.
I had a quick question. So with the PSM in out fees being 0, I think another part of this conversation is trying to move, you know, markets participants' perception of DAI towards this idea that DAI can be treated at par. And I saw in the forums, some of the engineering team talked about how that might be a problem for some protocols to actually treat DAI at par, like hard coding values, rather than taking like, you know, the actual floating rate on the market. And I'm curious about that perspective. Like, should other protocols treat DAI as par? And yeah, that whole side of it.
I mean, that introduces risk for the other protocols, basically. You know, I guess strictly speaking, it's helpful to Maker because it, you know, sort of enforces the peg in more places. But like, right, if you imagine that, you know, you're Aave, say, and you commit to always treating DAI as $1 in like collateral factor calculations, you know, what if DAI like actually depegs significantly? You know, basically Aave could become, you know, have some sort of solvency problem in relation to that. You know, where people could be protected from liquidations when they really shouldn't be, right? Like if DAI is actually trading at 50 cents on the market and Aave is counting it as $1, people can borrow a lot more than they should. And it starts to create risk for that protocol. So, you know, that's a protocol by protocol decision basis, you know, for them to make based on maybe whatever benefits might be offered to them for making such a commitment, like partnerships with Maker. And it's, you know, it's really, I think it's really more like a financial risk question than anything.
I should probably jump in here and say that, you know, I did have some posts on that topic. I will reiterate that those are my own opinions. They do come as a surprise to me in the fact that we've been spending a good deal of time in PE with our priorities trying to reduce our USDC exposure. And this is a dramatic shift in the other direction, where we would be effectively saying that we will take on any amount of USDC to get to the point where we hit parity, not with the dollar, but with USDC. So consider that if, you know, USDC were to change their implementation and become, you know, KYC only, that could reduce the value of USDC on the market to under $1. And us choosing to peg to USDC rather than to whatever the market price is could have some considerations. I do understand that there is the desire to take on as much of this as possible to grow and expand by telling partners that we can provide USDC in exchange for these loans that they'd be taking, but we don't have those solutions yet. So in the meantime, we're just taking on piles of USDC, and I disagree with the risk assessment that it would take 250 million USDC to get to peg. As we approach the peg value, the amount of USDC that we would have to take on actually increases almost exponentially to get down to that level. And it's taken 3 billion USDC at this point to get us down from, I think, an 800 million spread last year to a 250 million spread now. So like there are wider considerations than that. But again, like from the PE's team perspective, we will do whatever makers holders want. It seems like we might want to consider how we can get this USDC off the books. And from a personal opinion, from another personal standpoint, I am an American. I think a lot of the Americans in the DAO are more concerned about the USDC risk than the non-Americans. I don't know why that is, but America does have a history of maintaining its hegemony over their control of the dollar, and I hope we all consider that. And that's it for my soapbox, I think. Thanks.
Can I ask a technical question here? So we go to zero. Does this mean somebody can flash loan 100 million USDC out of the PSM, or is that technically impossible?
Yeah, they can do that.
Well, yeah, they could flash loan DAI, purchase 100 million USDC in the PSM, and then do something with it. Of course, they have to pay it back by the end of the transaction. But yeah,
okay. I mean, I guess I just want to make a point that the idea of setting this to zero, it does have implications, many of which might be unintended. And so if anything, I would leave the bottom side open, buy basically, sell DAI for a little bit above USDC1, right? Don't bracket to zero directly. Just leave if you want to. I think the band is tight enough personally. Here's the question. What's the reasoning for actually going to zero? Because the band is insanely tight right now. I mean, I know what Rune's proposal is, but what's the real reason here? What do we get for doing this?
I think I can chime in here. Our growth is non-existent right now, or at least very poor compared to the growth of some of our competitors. You can utilize sucking in tons of USDC, which DAI will basically almost always have a premium because of this almost like yield farming premium compared to USDC, and because there's kind of less of it. So we can use this to bootstrap the DAI supply growth, and because all of the USDC in the PSM is protocol owned, we can then just reallocate the USDC to wherever we want to reallocate it to, right? So you have some optimal mix of how you want to have the portfolio backing DAI. Okay, great. Just use the USDC in there to do that. One side of it is, okay, fine. You can promise real world asset originators, right? If we have 4 billion or 5 billion of USDC in the protocol, right? This is the, order of magnitude of deal that we can accomplish, right? With zero slippage, right? So I would argue against that. You want this 1.0001, no, you just want the 1-to-1. So you can be like, one DAI is one USDC, which is $1, no slippage, no fees. This is what you get, right? In terms of, okay, have we been scheming for ways to get USDC off the books? Sure, but I don't think it's a short-term problem. I think we're more just kind of panicking a bit. And I want to push back a little bit on what Brian said. I'm an American too. I know how America has dealt with stuff in the past. I don't think that they're agile enough to pull anything like that off, remotely soon. We have plenty of time to do this, right? And in terms of the kind of clean money kind of initiative, we would basically just park our money in ESG bonds, right? In a trust somewhere, right? In some friendly jurisdiction or multiple trusts in multiple friendly jurisdictions, right? So you just convert all of the USDC into ESG bonds. Great. Now you've parked your money in those. You've got the USDC off your books. You've monetized it a little bit. And the ESG bonds are still fairly liquid enough, right, that you can then invest in these kind of larger green projects. So when we say, oh, we should, increase PSM fees to zero, the point entirely is to suck up as much USDC as we can so we can use that as kind of a slingshot for the next steps.
And yeah, I totally understand that, but like we have 3 billion right now, right?
It is
we're not using it.
It is already fatal, right? Even if you reduced it to 2 billion, like we took all the efforts of the world, you know, we tried to park USDC liquidity in in Uniswap and Balancer and Curve and in every single thing, you would never get it all off your books. It would still be fatal. So if it's going to be fatal regardless, let's at least get the benefit out of it instead of having some squabble over like, well, is it going to be like, you know, chopping off 2 of our limbs or chopping off 3 of our limbs, right? No matter what, we're dead. So let's at least get the full benefit out of it.
Yeah. See, Chris has raised his hand. We'll try to go to that since I think a lot of people want to speak here. So if you want to say something next, please do raise your hand or type in chat.
Yeah, I was anticipating the argument that this is like we already have a fatal amount of existential risk, and I think that there's still like a very real perception argument about whether or not Maker is attempting to risk balance its collateral portfolio. If we make this change, we are going to suck on this existential risk beyond anything we could fix in the short term, and I think that's going to have like a really bad consequence for PR for people to be like, well, Maker's not even trying to solve this. I mean, if you look at the like pie charts today, they're actually rebalancing like really nicely with PAX, with USDC. We pulled on a lot of WBTC and F. I mean, we are actually balancing. And the other thing is we don't have yet this this capital sink that we want to stick this stuff into. So the ESG bonds or any of the real world assets, we're still sort of bootstrapping that. I guess I would argue, I don't disagree with the approach of like trying to have this sort of capital battery. I just don't think that we need to do it right this second. I think that we can wait until we start like flowing funds into these other projects, and then we do it. And to do it in the short term, I think is going to cause us to take a huge PR hit because it's basically the DAI is wrapped USDC memes just write themselves at this point.
Yeah, so why fight it? It's like we're getting the negative externalities without getting the benefits. That's what I don't understand here. It's like we're already so far in this direction, so let's at least get the upside instead of only the downside. You're not going to change the narrative by reducing the USDC PSM even by $1 billion. People will say that it's still wrapped USDC. It's still, has a huge USDC hole on its balance sheet, right? That can be blacklisted. You're not going to change the narrative that quickly.
But users are going to care, Nick. Once and there is already some type of regulatory action happening against USDC, right? Like the SEC is not just investigating USDC. Their actual like enforcement division is discussing actions with them. So the second we take on, like the second USDC takes on some sort of like regulatory action, all of a sudden DAI is going to look a lot riskier. Now there is like an interesting play. I'm going to like make your side of the argument. If that regulatory action is not banning, let's say protocols, let's say it's just KYC for individual participants, but like the PSM wouldn't get banned or blacklisted, then DAI does stand to inherit the entire market if the regulatory action comes down that basically stops non-KYC parties from transferring DAI, but USDC can still, transferring USDC, but USDC can still like go into protocols. If that happens, then we basically act as a giant like trade. Everyone puts their USDC, and then eventually it'll be USDP and GUSD and all of that. They'd put it into Maker, they get uncensorable DAI out, and then KYC parties would basically exit our books with the USDC. So I could definitely see an angle there, but that's a huge gamble. And I still feel like, we don't need to like take that risk on into the present. We can make these changes. There's no urgency to make these changes if we just put them off until we're like capable of like, actually like exiting some of that balance on our books. So I'll yield now. That's a lot of like talking. Other people can talk.
So to me,
Nick, can we have someone else, please? Because it's 3 people waiting. So we can come back to you at the end of this time.
I know Nadia's had her hand up the longest.
Yes, I wanted to add that I understand where this come from, and I understand why Seb is asking for this, because in the past, as the BD team and now in growth, we have seen this as a problem, because actually we had an opportunity in the past where this organization needed a decentralized stablecoin, which is like rare, because like you always heard that people don't care about decentralization. But well, in that case, that was an important feature. But because we couldn't offer to them the one-to-one from DAI to USD, that was a problem, because they were at some point like losing money in the flow. So I understand why for SEP this is important, because when you are going outside the crypto world, the one-to-one is really, really important. And when you're talking about millions in one transaction, losing 10 basis points or 20 basis points, it's a lot of money. So yes, like actually at that for that opportunity in the past, but we couldn't do it, and we lost that opportunity, and that went through USDC, although they were looking for a decentralized stable coin. So yeah, it's the Venezuelan aid project, exactly. That's the one I'm talking about. So I understand the risk, and actually Seb asked me about what were my thoughts about having the PSM zero fees, and I told him like I was like I didn't know what to think, because I understand the risk, and I understand that we are charging fees because we are taking the centralization risk when we are accepting the centralized stablecoins. But on the other side, I understand that if we want, like if we really want to do business with real companies, they are expecting the one-to-one from DAI to USD. And the only way to offer to them that is to have the PSM with zero fees, because in that way we are using the PSM as an on-off ramp solution using the Paxos rails and the USDC rails. So I think it's important for us to think, if we really want to do the real world assets thing, and we want to engage with more real companies, not just the crypto ones, having the PSM on zero is important.
Thanks for providing that perspective, Nadia. I know Monet Supply was next, if you still have something to say.
Yeah, I wanted to just make like a couple comments. We've been like sort of making a push to try and externalize some of our stablecoin holdings. So examples like putting it into the like the GUni DAI USDC vault, and other kind of similar ideas where we basically have users owning the USDC as part of like a big liquidity pool with many different people. And at least the thesis is that we're less vulnerable to like targeted actions, or like basically being like singled out for freezes or blacklisting. And if we do set the PSM fees all the way down to zero, I expect that would kind of like eliminate that option where we can externalize some of the holdings in LPs, because any, if we're charging 0%, any trades would just go through the PSM rather than LPs. So it would kind of like eliminate the demand for that. So yeah, just something to consider. I'm personally, I like being able to externalize some of that blacklisting risk. And yeah, we might end up sort of closing that door on ourselves. And then, yeah, I mean, the only other thing I'd comment is that I think it would have like a pretty big impact on Uniswap, and then also Curve, and like where people hold their DAI for LP purposes. So yeah, just another kind of general consideration.
Excellent, thank you. And Maker Man, you're the last one with your hand raised.
God, great, thanks. I want to echo what Monet Supply said. We can externalize this risk by using LP pools, right? And our USDC is already creating DAI. If you think about this, you can actually match it with DAI and throw it into the LP pools, right? So we crush these markets. These LP pools are dead for us to externalize this risk. It's a bad idea in principle. Another question, when somebody wants to convert 100 million of whatever into 100 million equivalent of something else, I don't know any bank that will not charge a fee for that. And so, okay, USDC, if I come to Circle with 100 million USD, they're going to give me 100 or USDC, they're going to give me 100 million USD. But there's only the supporters, the only one that's going to do that. Nobody else is going to give you 100 million USD for 100 million USDC. No one. And so you look at these stable coins on the markets, they do not trade at one. I don't care how good the stable coin is. There isn't one that trades at one on every market everywhere. And so this idea, I understand growth here, and markets basically kind of want this. And there's lots of things we want, but sometimes they're not good. And so I really want to reiterate, we really don't want to close this gap. I want to come back to what Monet says. We would like to lay this risk off in a different way by earning some moderate return by providing LP to be able to convert between these coins for some small fee. It's not unreasonable. And so that's all I got.
Thank you. I don't know, Nick, if you still have something to add. If not, it might be good to hear from Seb. I know a lot of the real world assets originators have talked about the importance of DAI being exactly on peg. I don't know if you'd want to speak to that a little bit. I was noticing some questions in chat as to how much it really affects things.
No, I don't want to repeat what I said in chat. I've talked enough. I think everyone's sick of hearing from me.
You made a good point though, Nick, about if USDC does get banned by regulators in the PSM, it's likely going to be banned by regulators in the LP pools as well, right? And in that case, the LP pools aren't really going to like save Maker at all. They're all just going to become USDC or whatever else, and so the risk is still sitting there, and those funds, we could move the LPs off our books, but those funds will be trapped anyway. So.
Yeah, the GUnity stuff only protects us from targeted blacklist risk. It does not protect us from like a DeFi-wide blacklist event.
Well, can I, from a technical perspective, GUnity can still be liquidated in an auction, whereas a frozen token cannot. So those would stay on our books forever, whereas like an AUSDC or a CUSDC or just a general wrapped USDC, if we were to use that, we could still liquidate off, and presumably they would have some market value that an auction would, that a keeper would pay for.
I guess technically you could still pay an auction for locked USDC. It's just that it's going to always forever sit in the gem join adapter. So you get to have a VAT gem balance.
I'd say I don't think we should be driven too much by these sort of remote theoretical possibilities, and we should be more focused on like UX sort of stuff, like what Nadia is saying. These sort of, we're losing out on potential growth by having these sort of almost to a good solution, but not quite perfect to what people need, and focusing too much on this blacklist risk, which me personally, I find is a fairly remote possibility. So I think we should be careful about this on what we want to optimize for.
I appreciate all the perspective that's been shared and the many different voices. We do have another topic here, so I'm thinking this might be a natural time to move on. If there are any parting thoughts or last things people haven't got to say or ask, we'll give you a brief chance here to do so. Awesome. Not hearing anything. Like we said, there are signals on both of these topics today, so I do very much encourage people to go to the forums and continue this conversation there, as a lot of the thoughts we're sharing today would benefit from being preserved. All right, so moving on, we have a different signal that highlighted a couple different aspects we thought would be valuable to talk about, and that was Rune signal to increase the emergency shutdown module MKR threshold, as well as the governance pause delay, the GSM duration. Rune said on chat that he was unable to make it today, unfortunately, but thought this is still a very good topic to have. We thought it might be valuable to have someone from PE talk about like kind of the trade-offs here. Also happy to have risk or work goals, or I can spin on it for a little bit as well. So don't know if anyone's comfortable kicking us off.
I think maybe also for the recording, I'll just quickly explain what ESM threshold and governance pause, what those two things are, the governance pause delay. So the ESM threshold is the amount of MKR that's needed to trigger an emergency shutdown at Maker. And this is an extremely disruptive process. DAI becomes redeemable for a pro rata portion of the underlying collateral. And generally speaking, this is kind of like a game theoretical functionality that's meant to be there to stop any sort of worse things from happening. So it's kind of like an escape hatch. It gracefully winds down the system. Whereas the governance pause delay has to do with the amount of time between the passing of a vote and the execution of the contents of that vote. So yeah, so at the moment, I believe it's a 48-hour delay, and there's also office hours built into those. And feel free to correct me if I got any of those details wrong, people who know better than me.
Yeah, I'll just elaborate on the ESM. So the ESM, David touched on the fact that it's a sort of game theory mechanism that exists, and it basically exists as like a minority threat protection, right? So so the first instance in which we would use it is if a majority of MKR holders are going to vote for something that's super unpopular and they don't have consensus from the minority. They have to take into consideration the fact that a minority might shut the protocol down. And then sort of an extension of that is, you know, where do you distinguish between like an unpopular, or let's say a popular MKR action, but unpopular with a minority versus like a governance attack, right? So, so the second scenario is that there's a proper governance attack. It's clearly malicious, like, you know, is effectively going to steal all the collateral from everybody in the system. And the ESM, if MKR holders can't overcome the hat and drop that malicious action, the ESM exists as an instantaneous, like, you know, cage the system in case of emergency before the malicious action comes through. So that's the sort of ESM, and the two sort of play together, right? So the GSM delay, it also gives us more time to not take that sort of catastrophic nuke the system button, and actually allows us to like intervene in the case of governance attack. You know, find consensus, that sort of thing, right? So it makes sense that if you're going to increase one, like the threshold of the ESM, that you'd also want to increase the governance delay, the pause between when things can execute, because you're probably going to need that time to like find more consensus in order to get MKR holders to actually like burn their MKR to shut the system down. So.
Yeah, great overviews. Thanks, guys.
One question I had about the signal request was, you know, a doubling of the threshold from 75K to 150K seems like a lot, because even presently, like how much MKR do we even have in the governance contract? I think it's something like less than 200K, but actively participating like 40 to 50K a week. So I don't know, 150K really kind of bricks us, doesn't it?
Yeah, so why don't we take it in two parts? Let's talk about the ESM, because these really are like two complicated features. So yeah, if we took the ESM first, there is obviously having it exist for all the game theory that I had mentioned earlier seems to make sense. At a certain point though, like if we were to just make the change and let's say we made it 1 million MKR, well, there's not 1 million MKR in existence, right? So like it would be worthless. But you know, there's a lot of MKR that's like either encumbered or lost or just would not like burn in the case of emergency shutdown. So there is some threshold that's sort of unknowable to us where that minority threat, the game theory of that minority threat disappears. So if we set it too high above that threshold, we lose the sort of game theory preventions that I was talking about. So, you know, the question is like, has that game theory actually prevented active attacks in the past, right? Has there been somebody with the capacity to run like a governance attack or to push like some sort of minority will through, but they haven't done it because they were actually threatened by the ESM. And so I think those are kind of unknowable. But yeah, does anybody want to make a really strong argument for not changing it or changing it? Like, does anybody feel strongly?
I can maybe talk a little bit about changing it up because like, I kind of agree with you on the minority threat in that I think it's generally a good thing to have and that we shouldn't throw it away completely because it encourages like every participant to sort of take into account others' opinions, right? Like it's sort of it sort of pushes people towards consensus versus like majority rules, right? Which is like a great thing, like generally for sort of stability of the protocol in the long term. As for like where that is, I don't know. Like you said, it's hard to tell. 150K does seem quite high to me, based on what we've seen voting previously. Like it's very rare that we ever have 150K on the hat. I think we have seen it a few times, but not recently for sure. So I wonder, like, yeah, I don't know. I think the minority, like at that point, it's kind of equivalent to what we would normally take to pass an exec. So we would, in order for that to be useful, we would have to see like, I don't know, hundreds of thousands more maker like appear and become governance active and then want something, which I think is unlikely. So the flip side is obviously that you don't want it to be too low, otherwise there's the risk of people calling it maliciously. But I also don't think I also kind of think that risk is like overestimated. So just given like the cost of performing that attack.
Yeah, actually, on to the point of that attack, I don't think that there's any economic incentive for MKR holders to trigger a shutdown like that, unless they are, this is like a spiteful move, right? Unless they are a competitor, then there would be a strategic advantage to triggering shutdown. And then in the worst case scenario, you're a nation state actor competitor, and a nation state actor may be able to coerce like large enough MKR holders to trigger shutdown, and they would find that beneficial. So there are still two threats there.
I think saying that there's no financial incentive to trigger it is a little bit naive because of the power of financialization. Basically, like you can imagine a large player who doesn't really have much stake in crypto at all, and then they build a large short position on Maker and other cryptos, right? Because if Maker goes into emergency shutdown, I guarantee you not only does the price of MKR go down, but probably other pieces of DeFi and maybe even ETH has issues too. Although I think we're small enough now that it wouldn't be like a major event for ETH. But just even imagine somebody with a huge MKR short. If you can put that on in enough size compared to the cost of purchasing MKR and putting it into the ESM, you actually can have a profitable financial incentive.
You can. You do. I mean, yeah, I agree. It's possible, but like you need a lot of MKR available to short for that to be viable, I think.
Yeah.
Well, I agree.
If you can short if you could short other things than MKR, right? Like if we're assuming that the only way they're profiting is through an MKR short, like there might be right? There might be other ways like to
Yeah.
profit as well. You know, like you can imagine it's going to do things, right, to DAI. Like the price of DAI is probably going to trade somewhat below par, even if ESM is triggered, because there's a cost to doing all the redemptions. And so it's going to be bought at a discount after emergency shutdowns. So, you know, imagine that like you go ahead and you like, you know, you can probably say like short DAI to some extent, or I would need to think through it more, but I'm just saying, you know, you could probably profit in more ways than just crashing the price of MKR with an ESM attack.
I mean, if you're a competitor, it's just marketing budget, right? You destroy a growing project like Maker, and even if you don't profit at all from the trade, that could be a way of going about it. I don't know. I know it's far-fetched, but it's a risk.
I think it's whether like you can guarantee like profit from it, right? Because no one's going to want to do, well, I don't know, but like I don't imagine malicious actors would go to that much trouble unless they were like sure they could profit from it. And I think it's definitely possible that they could, but I think it would be difficult to be sure that you could. Like I think to the amounts to make it worth it, right?
We do have a few people raising their hands, so I think I'm gonna start calling on that. Monet Supply.
Hey, yeah, I just wanted to kind of share how I've been thinking about the threshold. It wouldn't necessarily just be like the current value of MKR that it would cost you to like do this attack, because if you bought even like 7.5% of the supply or what have you to be able to trigger it now, that would it would drive the price like up probably a pretty substantial amount. And you can borrow some of it from Aave or Compound, for example, but you would need then like some excess capital to like collateralize your position. So like however much the value of 7.5% of supply is now, you would need like a pretty substantial amount more capital than that to actually make this attack happen. Probably like 50% more at least. That being said, I think the ability to like short stuff like DeFi tokens on like centralized exchanges, it probably wouldn't be that hard to get enough short exposure to make it profitable.
Yeah, because you could short with leverage on centralized exchanges, and you know the borrowing is a great point. I mean, MKR will be very cheap after shutdown, most likely.
Maker Man, you got some stuff to add?
Yeah, I was gonna say, so leverage exposure, right? I've already written on this a year ago, right? That I considered this an attack vector. As DeFi grows, you get, look, DYDX allows pretty significant leverage. Pick your centralized exchange and then couple in any sort of analysis about how strongly correlated the markets are. So you can get a huge short depth in F, right? And you crash Maker by locking all the assets in there and basically forcing all DAI to be hitting up for those assets, most of which are USDC. You've got a real nice leverage short position, both in F and you can do Maker. And you're definitely going to have to pony up to buy some Maker to try to pull this off, because you're going to need some. I agree with Monet that these markets aren't deep enough to be able to buy it straight up. You're going to have to borrow it. You're going to have to buy some and accumulate, and then you set up your short positions, because the thing that isn't going to crash that you're going to make money on isn't just Maker, it's ETH, because you're going to basically shock the whole DeFi system doing this. You can short DAI potentially, although, and you would do this only if we pull the USDC from the PSM, by the way. You leave that as like 100 million exposure, that's going to get ripped out in an instant during this whole scenario. And so basically, if that's set up to go, you short DAI leveraged, you short ETH leveraged, and you short Maker leveraged to boot. And then you drop it in the ESM and watch what happens. And seriously, you can make enough money off that. Now, is that profitable based on accumulating enough maker you need to pull it off now? I don't know. But if you find one or two well-heeled maker players that are willing to run with you on that, it's a game over. So I basically posed a long time ago that maker going into the system to do stuff should have to sit in a wallet for a while, so that you can't flash the stuff out. You can't do it instantly. You have to do it with maker that was sitting there ready to go. And that's a different game. And then the question is how long and what are the implications of making it so that people have to wait to get into either the ESM or governance, or that maker has to sit and kind of simmer, to season is what I called it, before it can actually do stuff of this kind of importance in the system. That's all I got.
Thanks for those reflections. Yeah, so kind of commenting on the chat comments here. Looks like, this is really a question of like where's the right threshold for where we're at now and for the at least short runway of the foreseeable future. Yeah, Sam pointing out that higher seems to be agreed, but maybe not 150K. I don't want to close out any more nuanced perspective here. Might have heard a mic click on. Maybe, no. But we do want to talk.
I would just say that that's kind of my feeling too, of like, I think it's time to net reduce the risk from this. As maker grows, the incentive to attack grows, and as DeFi continues to financially mature and crypto markets financially mature, it becomes easier to attack as well. And so probably at some point in the future it shuts down. 150K feels too high to me as well. We struggle to get anything close to that amount of participation in governance pools, and I think we're still in a regime where you might need honest actors to respond and trigger the ESM, possibly on short notice. Like maybe if there's some sort of critical bug, or heaven forbid, but I think we're still in a regime where I feel safer to have it than not have it, but 150K sounds like it's high enough to probably just effectively disable it, because just imagine how many different VC funds and stuff you have to actually mobilize to move their MKR on short notice. It sort of defeats the instant nature of it, because it probably can't be triggered quickly enough to be practically effective.
Thanks, Kurt. We do have the other side of this, which is the GSM delay. So might direct us over there, because I think we have kind of, as Chris presented, similar linkage here, where it's like, well, ideally, you'd be able to use the delay in order to rally a vote, so you don't have to depend on the emergency shutdown. However, there are plenty of cases imaginable where you wouldn't be able to do that. So having one that is too long to be effective when a bug is discovered is not good, whereas having governance delay that's too short and thus doesn't give you enough time to actually consider an alternative other than the ESM would not be great.
Yeah, so I'll give a quick opinion here, which is that I think at 2 days, the governance delay is already far too long to matter in the event of most, bugs or hacks. Response times for DeFi incidents are minutes to hours at best. The compound thing was basically it was mostly over within the first 2 hours, and then took people a little bit longer to figure out the reservoir thing, but that was still within 24 hours, right? And that was a slow attack by most DeFi standards. Usually they're over in a block. So we're already in a position where the GSM delay is far too long to effectively respond to any urgent issue. And we have strategies for dealing with those called instant access modules, right? We can freeze the oracles, instantly with a governance vote, for example. And we have that bypass because we know that, okay, the dangers, that's not a riskless thing, but it's less risky than full access to the system. And an Oracle attack is dangerous enough that we need the ability to respond instantly. So we already have a solution for these things that need instant responses, and it's called instant access modules, which can have various logic for how you trigger them. It can be MKR weighted voting. It can be based on just on-chain conditions. For very minor things, you could even have like a multi-sig to handle it. Right. So on the other hand, so what I'm arguing is that there's not really a lot of downside to making the governance delay go from 2 days to 4 days. Like if we're from 2 days to 2 months, well, that would be a pretty meaningful change. But with like 4 days, you could still do a weekly cycle in executive voting, and it really shouldn't mess up too much operationally. Although if anybody has something I've overlooked there, let me know. But on the other hand, 2 days versus 4 days is a big gain in terms of responding to some sort of malicious governance attack. So, imagine malicious actors managed to overtake the hat just because like MKR was slow to move and got spread out on proposals or something, and some malicious spell is queued up. There's going to be some response time for that. You're going to have to mobilize MKR holders to retake the hat, and then you're going to have to do technical things that allow you to drop the malicious spell. And I think 2 more days is a meaningful amount of time to respond to a threat like that. Also it's meaningful in the case that like if I lost my train of thought there, but it's meaningful to respond to a governance attack in that amount of time. So I think it's a good idea at this point to lengthen it out a little bit because it has tangible benefits and the downsides don't seem that bad. All right, that's enough rambling.
Louder wants to provide some pushback here, so I'll toss it over to you.
Yes, I'm really not convinced that there isn't a big difference between 2 and 4 days. The DeFi bugs, maybe even that I think is pretty shaky, that assumption. But I think the much bigger risk here is that we're being lulled to sleep because we're in a stable situation where we seem to have forgotten about the market turmoil and everything that requires changes to the protocol on a timescale of days, and where a week would make a big difference, right? If we discuss USDC risk, a regulatory action and so on, 2 days versus 4 days, it could make a very big difference, right? And I honestly don't see the need to make it any longer. I think the 2 days it's working. So yeah, I think we're not doing the full spectrum analysis here. We're just changing it because we haven't needed it in a while, and we're not thinking the risks through, I believe. I'm pretty strongly opposed to changing it to 4 days, because 4 days is a really long reaction time to anything that might happen.
So I think like 3 days over 2 days might have some worth, in that like 48 hours can be timed to be like the whole of the weekend. Whereas if you have like a 72-hour delay, then you at least guarantee like 1 working day, like absent holidays. I guess it's not too much given that someone would just time things for holidays, but yeah, I don't know. 4 days does seem a little bit arbitrary in terms of just why 4 or not 2 or 3 or 5 or whatever.
And it's probably worth noting that a number of times our executives have office hours modifications as well, right? So a 4-day GSM plus the office hours means you could easily have a full week before you're able to enact something, depending on what it touches. Go for it, Chris.
This is where our risk management fails, honestly, because it should be pretty easy to pull up like the list of risks that we need to consider in changing this parameter, and we don't have that, and we go by a recent memory of things. And I think that's in this case it's pretty bad. I mean, maybe chances are relatively low that something would go catastrophically wrong if we move it from 2 to 4 days, but I do not believe we actually know that. Like, we haven't made that analysis properly, I believe. I think I cannot.
I'm not really sure I agree with this thing that there's a large probability weight of things that we could respond to with a 2-day delay and not a 4-day delay. Like Black Thursday was over in 12 hours. A 24-hour delay was far too much back then. I mean, do you have some scenario like or example where like if a protocol had a 2-day delay instead of a 4-day delay, you know, it would have helped them? Like, you know, I agree that such things could exist, but I just really haven't, I've been in DeFi 2.5 years here, and I really haven't seen an example of something where 2 versus 4.
That last one is a bad argument, Kurt, because I'm longer in DeFi than you are, but
yeah. Well, have you seen one? Can you give me an example?
Well, that's my point. I think we've forgotten about a lot what happened. Around the time that that DAI was moving away from the peg, and that was creating a lot of concern. There were a lot of things that were considered that where the days mattered. For example, like Black Thursday, sure, but even Black Thursday, like being able to, let's say, cover or react within 1 crash versus 2 crashes that might happen within the course of a week. Any changes that we've made to the auction mechanisms, for example, things like that, you really don't want to wait for 4 days to put these things in place.
Well, if you don't want to wait for 4 days, you don't want to wait for 2 days either. I don't know. We may be splitting hairs here. There may just be no meaningful difference between them. But
I think Sam brought up a really good example in chat.
Do you want me to say it?
Yeah, go for it, Sam, and then
someone should.
Then we'll get to Chris, because I know he's been patient.
Yeah, just my example is we hit the global DC in May, I believe, during that big crash, and there was no minting for 2 or 3 days, I think. So that's something where we wanted that to go through ASAP. It could have some pretty significant effects on the peg.
All right, for real now, Mooney.
Yeah. It's funny because you guys like basically hit all my points periodically while going through that. It does sound like, first of all, I strongly agree with Wouter here and I think we have some old risk analysis around this, but we probably should like have some risk weights on it. We can argue over specific probability weights, and that would maybe help inform us as to whether or not we wanted to make this choice. But in addition to that, there may be some benefit in taking other parameters in the system that would need to be changed, and thinking about exactly like what would be suitable for either an instant access module or a MOM with a multi-sig or something like that, because we may be able to benefit. We may be able to have our cake and eat it too in some cases, I guess. But yeah, I'll remind everyone that on Black Thursday, leading up to Black Thursday, we had just gone through like this big PR thing where Megazol2 basically published all this stuff about theoretical governance attacks and whatnot on the chief, and so we had in response to that finally added this. I think it was a 72-hour delay at the time to try and mitigate governance attacks. And what we've done is we leaned too hard on that end of the risk spectrum. And I think that if I'm remembering correctly, it went active like literally a few days before Black Thursday. And then Black Thursday happened, and rather than us being able to intervene and either circuit break auctions or I don't know, change like auction parameters in a way that would have like accounted for the level of network congestion, we were basically, our hands were tied. So there's nothing that we could have done, and I think that risk shouldn't be understated. So yeah, anyway, those are the points I wanted to make.
Thanks, Chris. Monet Supply?
the GSM delay plays into like a couple areas of risk management, or like kind of what we review for asset parameters. So like as an example, we look at like, okay, what's the maximum amount of extra USDC that we could sort of like end up putting on within, 2 days or what have you, before we'd be able to make governance changes. So if we lengthen the governance delay, then there's like some of those parameters might need to be looked at again. Like, are we really still comfortable adding up to $1 billion of stable coins a day if it would take us 4 days to make any changes, or would we want to like reduce that? Or yeah.
Yeah, definitely a good point that like a lot of our risk assumptions probably hinge on this delay factor as well. Long posted the link to the signal in the chat. Definitely encourage people to visit it. Right now we have the vast majority of people voting yes to the increase on both of these, which doesn't super reflect the nature of this call, but might be worth a revisit there. Are there other topics or other things we wanted to cover? Sorry, not topics, other aspects of this topic that we wanted to cover?
Is it possible to give a more granular definition of exactly, like, I know Rune made the signal request, but maybe we could break it into a couple different options on each front and let people sort of do that, or we could do a ranked choice poll on chain. That may have us land more granularly on a set of like Goldilocks changes that are going to work for these parameters.
Yeah, so someone else can do another better signal request. Like regardless of whether this one passes or fails, we can like follow it up with the result of the other one. So like worst case, we end up doing this for like a week, I guess, if it gets voted through on chain as well, and then we change it to something else if people want.
Yeah, I think a key question is whether these parameters really need to be connected this closely, because I think there's a fairly strong argument for at least raising the ESM threshold, and the question becomes, does that actually necessitate like lengthening the governance delay? It does certainly like raise your response time if you need to trigger the ESM in response to like malicious majority governance attack. Is that strictly necessary? I don't know. How do you tune those? Hard to say, right? Because like if you increase the ESM threshold, you are definitely increasing one of your risks, which is the malicious majority attack. I think that one's actually probably pretty low probability already anyway, though.
So maybe make the point, it's not, hang on. So I was gonna say, it's not just like the attack thing that it's supposed to stop, right? Like it doesn't have to be like a malicious majority that it's supposed to defend against. It can be just like a majority that wants something that like a majority thinks is unreasonable. Like it doesn't have to be an attack, it can be something.
Yeah, in the past, I've glibly called the ESM a minority griefing mechanism. It's one of the most debated things, and it's all about like how you probability weight different like bad scenarios, which has made it really one of the hardest things to reason about, because it's all just based on what your priors are for what's actually most likely to go wrong. I think certainly the more the system matures and bakes in, the argument of like you need it for critical bugs decreases, but the like governance attacks and what even is a governance attack it's very philosophical, and I think I've flip-flopped a few times in the past on exactly how necessary it is, how useful it is. I almost default to like things are going pretty well right now. So unless there's a very strong argument to mitigate risk in one particular direction, maybe leave well enough alone.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing your thoughts, everybody. You know, these are kind of complex topics, so appreciate getting to hear from so many voices and getting so much perspective on why we're considering the things we are. I know, yeah, Bourbon, you had asked for a couple minutes here, so this might be your time to shine.
Yeah, so this is basically about debt ceilings and where we are in the market cycle, and sort of ties into, everyone can hear me, right? Sort of ties into the GSM delay stuff. So we are, I believe, entering the final stage of the market cycle, which is going to be quite bumpy ride, but things are going to, I think, grow quite exponentially. And our debt ceilings could start getting hit quite quickly as prices move up. And I would like to see all of them raised, and maybe the instant access module on them, like the time lock, like reduced potentially, because I don't want another GSM delay sort of thing. I think if things do actually do like a 3, 5, 10x kind of quickly here, we want to have DAI available for me to boost, for whoever to boost. I don't know how much people love wrap Bitcoin. There's a whole bunch of contention about it. I am long on Bitcoin through DeFi Saver using WBTC. Whether or not I believe in Bitcoin long term necessarily doesn't really matter. I do think it's gonna do its sort of thing till the end of the cycle. So I would like to see a WBTC B vault. That is less urgent. I just don't want debt ceilings to be getting hit on the way up. For me to boost, for anyone else to be able to boost, and if we cap out at some point mid-run, I don't want something like a GSM delay to hold this up for 3-4 days or something like that. And yeah, so before things really start getting out of hand, maybe there could be some discussion over increasing the debt ceilings available to ETH-A, ETH-B especially, and how quickly the timer unlocks to raise the TCIM. Basically, those are my thoughts. I don't know if anyone has thoughts on that. Maybe I should make a signal request, but yeah.
Yeah, thanks for sharing, Bourbon. Definitely in kind of the spirit of the post Long put up earlier this week, where it's like, yeah, if you have something you believe is right and that the community should be considering, yeah, please do throw up a signal request, because that's kind of what the whole process is about. In terms of the assets with the debt ceiling instant access module, there's obviously a lot of different ways you can play with that. Yeah, that's a good point. Long saying maybe we should discuss in detail later. I just kind of wanted to throw out from the government side, right? Like you can mess with the max line, you can mess with the TTL, the time to increase again. You can mess with the gap parameter, the how big we're targeting the gap between the DC and the available debt. So there's a number of different ways you could basically encourage broader access to these funds as DCs start to tighten. Yeah, so just fun governance parameters to consider for a signal request. And as always, we're happy to help out, show templates, show resources if anyone is doing uncomfortable for any reason on the signal request. But we do encourage people to make their own requests when they're bringing the proposal forward.
Yeah, I guess Peyton later point me in the right direction where to make the forum post for this signal request. But
happy to.
If anyone else wants to chime in with thoughts on this.
I'll whenever when you do make the signal request, I'll just remind everybody that's going to consider it, or if you're going to make it, that the risk of the instant access module is that a price crashes in an asset, and that price crashes beyond the collateralization threshold within that time period, which allows for the minting of unbacked DAI. And that unbacked DAI then basically hits the surplus buffer. So just whatever parameters you end up choosing, be mindful that's the counterbalance it's all Goldilocks. We should just name this meeting the Goldilocks meeting. That's the thing we're trying to balance on the other side is not allowing too much unbacked DAI to be minted in the case of like extreme market shock.
Yeah, I agree. So I don't know what parameters I would be like seeking specifically. It would be more of like a general sort of idea of, you know, loosening things up.
So probably some combination between that TTL and the gap is, you know, might be worth thinking through the other side of the scenario with the TTL and the gap. So think about what you want, what we want going into like a rocketing market, and what's going to work. And then also think about what happens if the parameters are set that way on the downside.
Yeah, good point. Definitely. I mean, you know, an encouragement for people to use DeFi saver or some sort of liquidation protection, which mitigates our risk with automatic repays before they get liquidated, emergency repays. But not everyone uses automation to protect their vaults, so it does expose us to more risk. But that sort of integration can't be like pushed through that quickly. But yeah, I mean, good things to consider.
Right on. Well, there's been a lot of great discussion today. Definitely encourage everyone to bring it back to the forums. As we said, there's a couple signals we discussed heavily today where you might need to change your vote or voice some of the opinions or reflections you've had after the conversation today. That's what the forum's there for that engagement and to document it. So please do. Really appreciate everyone today sharing so many different perspectives, and yeah, happy Thursday. Another meeting in the books. I'll be shutting off the recording now, and as always, see you in the forums and in the chat. Thanks, everyone.